In the year 67 AD, if you walked through the marble corridors of Nero's palace, you would witness something that would make your soul recoil in horror. The most powerful man on earth, draped in purple and gold, tenderly stroking the face of his beautiful young wife. But the servants whisper a truth so disturbing that speaking it aloud meant death. That woman was once a boy named Sporus, and what the emperor did to him represents the most calculated act of psychological destruction in human history. This isn't just another story of Roman excess. This is the blueprint for how absolute power transforms love into possession, grief into madness, and a human being into a living doll designed to serve one man's twisted fantasy. What you're about to learn will show you the darkest capabilities of unchecked authority, and how those same mechanisms of control operate in your world today, refined and perfected across 2,000 years of human manipulation. Nero wasn't born a monster. When he ascended to power at 16, Romans believed they were witnessing the dawn of a golden age. He reduced taxes, funded public entertainment, and seemed to genuinely care about his people's well-being. But absolute power doesn't corrupt gradually, it reveals what was always hidden beneath the surface. And what was hidden in Nero's psyche was a capacity for obsession so complete, so totalizing, that it would consume everything in its path. The woman who triggered this descent into madness was named Poppaea Sabina. Beautiful beyond description, intelligent enough to match Nero's grandiose self-image, and ambitious enough to share his dreams of eternal glory. But Poppaea wasn't just another pretty face in the imperial court. She possessed sharp political instincts that made her either a formidable ally or a dangerous enemy. When Nero first saw her, something clicked in his mind that would ultimately destroy them both. The affair between Nero and Poppaea began as typical Roman scandal, but what started as adultery quickly evolved into something far more sinister: genuine obsession. This wasn't love, it was psychological ownership. Nero didn't just want Poppaea's body or her affection. He wanted to possess her so completely that she would cease to exist as an independent human being and become an extension of his own will. Ancient historians describe Nero's behavior during this period as increasingly erratic and possessive. He would fly into murderous rages if other men so much as looked at Poppaea during public functions. He stationed guards around her at all times, ostensibly for protection, but really to monitor her every interaction. He commissioned dozens of portraits and sculptures, not for public display, but for his private chambers, so he could look upon her image even when they were apart. But here's what the history books don't tell you about obsessive love. It's not actually about the other person. It's about control. It's about the terrified recognition that another human being has power over your emotional state, and the desperate attempt to eliminate that vulnerability by eliminating their independence. Nero's love for Poppaea was really his war against his own psychological weakness, his inability to exist without her validation. The marriage that followed was a spectacle of unprecedented luxury, but it couldn't satisfy Nero's need to possess Poppaea completely. He began isolating her from family and friends, surrounding her with people who owed their positions entirely to his favor. He would spend hours simply watching her as she went about daily activities. This wasn't romantic devotion. It was the behavior of someone who had confused love with ownership, who saw another human being not as an independent person, but as a beautiful object that existed solely for his pleasure. Poppaea, for her part, understood the dangerous game she was playing. She was intelligent enough to recognize that her beauty and Nero's obsession gave her unprecedented power, but shrewd enough to realize this power came with enormous risks. She began using her influence to advance her family's interests, building a network of supporters who would protect her if Nero's affections ever wavered. But Poppaea had one fatal flaw. She wasn't afraid to stand up to Nero. Unlike everyone else in the imperial court, who had learned to anticipate the emperor's moods and arrange their behavior accordingly, Poppaea retained her independence of spirit. She would argue with him about policy decisions, criticize his artistic pursuits, and even mock his performances when she thought they were subpar. In any healthy relationship, this would be called honesty. In the context of absolute power, it was a death sentence waiting to happen. The details of what happened on that fateful day in 65 AD vary depending on which ancient historian you believe, but the outcome was always the same. During what started as a typical domestic argument, some sources say about Nero coming home late from chariot races, others about his theatrical pursuits. The emperor lost control in a way that would haunt him forever. Poppaea was pregnant at the time, carrying what would have been their second child, and perhaps the stress made her less willing to tolerate Nero's increasingly erratic behavior. According to Tacitus, the argument escalated when Poppaea dared to criticize Nero's priorities, suggesting he cared more about his public image than his responsibilities as a husband and father. What happened next has been debated by historians for centuries, but the consensus is that Nero, in a fit of rage, either kicked or struck his pregnant wife with such brutal force that she suffered fatal internal injuries. The man who commanded 30 legions had just destroyed the one thing he actually cared about. The scene that followed reveals something crucial about the psychology of abusers. They genuinely believed their own mythology. Nero reportedly threw himself on Poppaea's body, alternately begging her forgiveness and commanding her to live, as if his imperial authority extended even over death itself. He summoned the best physicians in Rome, offering them fortunes to save her life, threatening them with torture if they failed. But it was too late. Poppaea died within hours, taking with her the unborn child who might have been Nero's heir. In that moment, something fundamental broke inside the emperor's mind. The grief that followed wasn't just emotional devastation, it was a complete break with reality. Nero's mourning became legendary throughout the empire. He refused to have Poppaea's body burned according to Roman custom, instead having it embalmed and placed in a tomb more elaborate than those of previous emperors. He declared her divine, established a cult in her honor, and spent days talking to her corpse as if she could still hear him. The imperial court now had to navigate an even more treacherous landscape. Courtiers were expected to participate in the fiction that Poppaea was somehow still alive, referring to her in present tense, and leaving her favorite seat empty at banquets. Anyone who suggested the emperor should move on was immediately exiled or executed. This wasn't just grief, it was the systematic enforcement of a delusional reality where the most powerful man on earth got to decide what was true. But here's the terrifying part. This same psychological mechanism operates in every system of unchecked power. When authority figures lose touch with reality, everyone around them must pretend the delusion is truth or face consequences. The emperor's broken mind became the official version of reality, and an entire empire had to live inside his psychological prison. It was during this period of manufactured insanity that Sporus first entered Nero's line of sight. Though the young man had no idea, he was walking into a nightmare designed by madness itself. Comment the emperor's delusion if you're beginning to see how power creates its own reality. Comment it twice if you understand that this same mechanism is operating in your world today, refined and perfected by 2,000 years of psychological manipulation. Because what comes next will show you how quickly a human being can be transformed into a living fantasy when absolute power decides reality is negotiable. Sporus was probably around 14 or 15, born into slavery in the imperial household and freed as a child. He had been raised within the palace walls, receiving education that prepared him for administrative duties. This was actually a position of relative privilege. Freedmen in imperial service often enjoyed better conditions than freeborn citizens of lower classes. But this privilege came with complete dependence on imperial favor. They could be elevated to great influence, but also discarded, punished, or killed on a whim with no legal recourse. What made Sporus special in Nero's eyes wasn't his intelligence or skills. It was his face. Multiple ancient sources agreed that the young man bore an uncanny resemblance to dead Poppaea, particularly around the eyes and delicate bone structure. In a world where Romans believed physical resemblance indicated deeper spiritual connection, this similarity would have seemed almost supernatural. The first time Nero saw Sporus after Poppaea's death, something clicked in the emperor's broken mind. Here was a chance to undo the irreversible, to bring back what he had destroyed. The resemblance was so striking that for a moment, Nero may have actually believed he was seeing Poppaea's spirit returned in a new form. Of course, there was one obvious problem. Sporus was male, but for a man who had convinced himself he was a god, who had spent months talking to a corpse, changing someone's gender seemed like a minor obstacle. What happened next represents one of the most calculated acts of cruelty in human history. Nero didn't just decide to force Sporus to dress as a woman, he decided to make the transformation permanent. The emperor summoned the best physicians in Rome and ordered them to perform surgery on the young man, purely to make him appear more feminine. This wasn't just mutilation, it was systematic destruction of Sporus' identity as a human being. The procedure was dangerous, painful, and irreversible, often resulting in death from infection or blood loss. The surgery took place in the Imperial Palace, in quarters specifically prepared for the purpose. Ancient surgical procedures were primitive, relying on basic instruments and crude anesthetics. The process would have been excruciating, lasting hours with significant risk of death. Sporus would have been held down by guards while physicians approached with their instruments, knowing his screams would fall on deaf ears. But this physical mutilation was only the beginning of his psychological destruction. Once Sporus recovered, a process taking weeks or months, Nero announced something that shocked even jaded Roman aristocrats. He was going to marry the young man in a full imperial wedding ceremony. The preparations took months and consumed enormous resources. Sporus was given a new name, Sabina, after the dead empress, and moved to special quarters where he could be prepared for his new role. Every detail of this preparation was designed to erase who he had been and replace it with who Nero needed him to be. Imperial seamstresses created an entire wardrobe, designing gowns that would flatter his modified physique and hide remaining masculine characteristics. Master jewelers crafted ornaments specifically for him, many incorporating gems that had once belonged to Poppaea herself. These weren't just accessories, they were tangible links to the dead woman, physical reminders of the person Sporus was being forced to replace. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a corpse was now a shackle binding him to a role he never chose. Makeup artists taught him cosmetic techniques to feminize his features. They showed him how to use kohl to make his eyes appear larger, how to apply rouge for rosy cheeks, how to use powders to soften facial angles. These lessons weren't just about appearance, they were exercises in systematic erasure of his original identity. Hairdressers instructed him in elaborate styling techniques fashionable among aristocratic Roman women. His hair was cut, curled, and arranged in complex patterns, often incorporating expensive ornaments. The process could take hours daily, requiring multiple servants and heated metal tools. But perhaps most psychologically damaging were the lessons in feminine behavior and deportment. Sporus was assigned tutors who taught him how to walk, sit, and gesture in appropriately ladylike ways. He learned how to hold his hands, position his feet, arrange his clothing when seated, and move through space conveying grace rather than masculine strength. Voice coaches worked with him to modify his speech patterns, teaching him to speak in higher tones and adopt linguistic mannerisms associated with feminine discourse. This was perhaps the most challenging aspect, as vocal patterns are deeply ingrained and difficult to change consciously. Can you imagine the psychological torture of this transformation? Every day, Sporus was forced to look in mirrors reflecting back a stranger wearing his face. Every lesson in feminine behavior reminded him that his identity was being systematically erased. Every piece of jewelry that had once adorned a dead woman was now a physical reminder of his captivity. He was being transformed into a living memorial to someone else's obsession, his own humanity sacrificed on the altar of an emperor's delusion. The wedding was scheduled for spring 67 AD, timed to coincide with religious festivals that would add ceremonial weight. Nero spared no expense, treating it as a legitimate imperial wedding worthy of the greatest emperor in Roman history. The ceremony took place in the largest palace hall, decorated with imported flowers and illuminated by thousands of oil lamps. Musicians played traditional wedding songs, while servants offered the finest wines and delicacies to assembled guests. To outside observers who didn't know the full story, it might have looked like a normal imperial wedding. But those in the know understood they were witnessing something unprecedented and disturbing. The most powerful man in the world was marrying a mutilated slave boy dressed as his dead wife, and everyone had to pretend this was normal. The emperor's delusion had become official reality, enforced by the threat of death for anyone who dared acknowledge what they were actually seeing. After the wedding, Sporus lived as Nero's wife for the remainder of the emperor's reign. He was expected to perform all the duties of an empress, attending state functions, receiving foreign dignitaries, participating in religious ceremonies. But perhaps most tortuously, he was expected to provide the emotional comfort that Nero had lost when Poppaea died. He had to pretend to love his captor, to find joy in his own destruction, to celebrate the erasure of everything he had once been. Ancient sources tell us that Nero would often talk to Sporus as if he were actually Poppaea, recounting memories of their relationship and expecting appropriate responses. Sporus had to learn not just how to look and act like a woman, but how to impersonate the specific woman, one he had never met, whose personality he could only guess at from Nero's rambling recollections. He became a living actor in a play written by madness, where the penalty for breaking character was death. The psychological mechanisms at work here reveal something crucial about how power operates. It doesn't just control behavior, it attempts to control reality itself. Nero wasn't satisfied with forcing Sporus to dress as a woman. He needed everyone to believe that Sporus actually was a woman, that his delusion was objective truth. This required the participation of the entire imperial court in a collective lie so extensive that it became its own form of reality. But here's what makes this story relevant to your life today. The same psychological techniques that transformed Sporus into Sabina are being used on you right now, refined and perfected across 2 millennia of human manipulation. Every time you're told to ignore the evidence of your own senses, every time you're pressured to participate in someone else's version of reality, every time you're made to feel crazy for questioning what authority figures tell you is true, you're experiencing the same mechanism that turned a young man into a living doll for an emperor's fantasy. The story of Sporus didn't end with Nero's death in 68 AD, when the emperor finally fell from power. Sporus found himself in an impossible position. He had been so thoroughly transformed that he could no longer function as a man. But his association with a hated tyrant made him a target for revenge. The new emperor, Otho, initially protected him, but when Otho was overthrown, Sporus faced execution. Rather than submit to further humiliation, he took his own life, the first choice he had been allowed to make in years. But Sporus' real tragedy wasn't his death. It was that he had been systematically prevented from ever becoming who he was meant to be. His natural development had been arrested, his identity erased, his potential sacrificed to serve another man's psychological needs. He had been transformed from a human being with infinite possibilities into a living monument to someone else's obsession. This is what absolute power does when it encounters beauty, talent, or anything else it desires. It doesn't just take possession, it destroys the thing's essential nature in the process. The techniques used to transform Sporus: systematic isolation, identity erasure, forced participation in delusion, punishment for authentic expression. These same methods are employed by every totalitarian system that has ever existed. They're the tools used by abusive relationships, controlling institutions, and manipulative ideologies. The scale changes, but the psychology remains identical. Break down the person's sense of self, replace it with something that serves your purposes, then force them to pretend they chose this transformation freely. Understanding Sporus' story isn't just about learning history. It's about recognizing these patterns when they appear in your own life. Every time someone tries to convince you that your perceptions are wrong, that their version of reality is the only acceptable one, that resistance to their control is a form of mental illness. You're seeing the same mechanism that transformed a free young man into an emperor's living doll. The difference is that now you know how the trick works. The question is, What are you going to do with that knowledge? Will you allow yourself to be transformed into someone else's fantasy? Or will you guard your authentic self with the same fierce determination that Sporus never had the chance to develop? The choice, unlike his, is still yours to make.